24th, 25th verse. King Nebuchadnezzar proclaims or requires, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire? But I see 4, unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the 4th has appearance of a god." One day, 2 gentlemen got together for lunch just to catch up on old times. So they were sitting there sharing stories, finding out what's going on in their lives, and reminiscing about old days. The conversation they had kind of continued. And at one point, they both kind of agreed that they experience God when they fly. James had been a pilot since he was a teenager, shared how he saw God in the beauty of soaring high above the earth. Up there, he could see miles of nature and creation. He could see the authority given to humanity through the technology that he saw below, through the architecture of the buildings and the roads. He experienced God and the freedom that he felt as he was loose from the bounds of gravity. James saw God all around him as he simply floated through the air in his plane. Tom listens to this and shakes his head. Tom's experience of God when he flies was just the opposite. Tom had a fear of flying. And so he spent his air travel time praying, asking for God to carry this plane safely and smoothly to whatever destination they were headed for. He knows that God hears his prayers, so he lifts them up in praise and in faith, knowing that God will assure safe passage. Praying that the pilots will have the skills and the abilities to handle anything that may happen. And during the entire journey, Tom continues to rely on his faith that God is ever present and ever powerful during this time of fear and trial for him. This morning we continue our walk through the book of Daniel. We're exposed to the witnessing and we experience God through Hananiah, Mishael's, and Azariah's testimony and faith, even in the face of persecution. Of course, we discussed how these 3 young men, along with Daniel and many others, were exiled from Babylon. And in that tradition, to reshape their minds and loyalties, we hear these 3 names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they were given after pagan gods. In this morning's passage, we hear them over and over, almost as if they're trying to reinforce that their old identities are gone. So these are the names that we know them as. But the beauty of their witness is the testimony of not just their faith in God, but also the testimony that we hear of God's faith and covenant with his people. In the story this morning, we get to experience how we are preserved during times of trial, during times of persecution, during times of frustration, by our ever-present God, as well as testifying to the omnipotent capabilities of our ever-powerful God. As God's people, we see how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego maintain their faith in God, who has never left them and will deliver them from anything that they may come up against. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Last week we shared how the pressure to conform in any society is a powerful tool. We shared how these young men remained dependent on the first 4 of the commandments: to glorify God when being pressured to move their lives into social confirmation. This week we see their faith playing as a role that they know God is always there with them. Again, Nebuchadnezzar acts upon a dream that Daniel interprets for him regarding this huge statue with a head made of gold. Nebuchadnezzar proceeds to build the entire statue, not of himself, but of one of his gods. He doesn't expect, he commands that all will bow down before it or face the consequences of being thrown into a burning, fiery furnace. To us, it may seem a little extreme and exaggerated that execution would come in the way of binding someone and placing them in a burning furnace. But it's reported that the Egyptians used this as a common means of execution for those found guilty of adultery, murder or conspiracy of murder, for sacrilege and rebellion. In Mesopotamia, execution by burning was also a provision for certain crimes and could be imposed by the king. We know this was not a made-up story. There is evidence that this was true as far as burning in the furnace. And additionally, we know that throughout history, there have been even more hideous means of death that have been used for reasons of genocide and torture. It does seem evident that this punishment faced by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was not an atypical means for dealing with those who went against the king's wishes. But this doesn't scare our young men. Our three young men, for they know that God is with them, and they know that God will deliver them, as sure as they are prepared to face their fate. They testify before the king and his court as to their faith by saying, "If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, that we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." And with that testimony, with that confession, their fate is sealed. And into the furnace they are thrown. Ironically, for these three, the furnace becomes a sense of freedom for them. As tradition has it, they were bound, their hands, their feet were tied up, and so that they would become like logs, not able to move, lying in the furnace. But the flames of freedom, however,